So hello everyone, we are here back at the Certain Matching Macro Finance today. We are doing something different. We are actually here to talk about a new book that's coming out, and it's a book in over-the-counter markets written by Julien Hugonnier, Ben Laster, and Pierre-Olivier Weill. Why don't you start talking about a little bit about you guys and how we start working together and working on this book? Ben?
Who do you want to start?
Well, take alphabetical order, maybe.
So yeah, why don't you start like it's in the book, Julien, and then Ben and Pierre.
Perfect.
Okay, great. So what did you want to know? You want to know how we decided to work on the book? That's the idea?
Yeah, why don't you talk a little bit about introduce yourself, who you are, and how you start working this topic, and how you met, and then we can talk about how you guys met.
Okay, so I'm Julien Hugonnier. I'm professor at EPFL in Switzerland, in Lausanne. I started working on this essentially when Darrell visited us for a couple of years. He was here back and forth in Lausanne. So we had the occasion to discuss lots of these topics with him. And then at some point, I was invited to discuss a paper of Pierre-Olivier and Guillaume Rocheteau, I think it was. Something like this, in Gerzensee. And so I went there. I met Pierre that we had already met before, but we didn't really know each other that well at the time. And we started discussing after the seminar. We realized we were actually both writing the same paper. So Pierre-Olivier and Ben were working at the time on a kind of general, Duffy-Galeano-Pedersen type of model with general distribution of types. And it turns out I was doing exactly the same thing at the same time. And so we matched, I guess.
Randomly, yeah.
And so from there, we wrote a couple papers, and I think we ended up with so much material that we thought maybe writing a book is a good idea. I guess.
Yeah, you want me to continue?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Okay, so let me introduce myself. So I'm Ben Lester. I work at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. I should probably say at some point that the views, anything we say here, are just my views and not those of the Fed. Seems especially important these days. Yeah, so to go back, so actually, it goes back even a little bit further for Pierre and I. So I was a graduate student at Penn, and Pierre visited Penn. I think Guillaume Rocheteau was actually visiting the Penn for the year, and the three of us had dinner, and we were talking about these things. And actually, so this would have been probably around 2005, maybe. And without even necessarily realizing it, I had already started working on this topic. I had been taking classes that did a lot of search theory, but more focused on monetary and labor economics. But I thought it would be interesting to work on models of the housing market. I had read one or two search models of the housing market. I thought it was a very good application of the framework. And so I was playing around with what I later realized was a slightly more general version of the sort of seminal paper of Duffy-Galeano-Pedersen. So in that paper, they keep the distribution of preferences among agents very simple, two types, just to try to generate trade. But I wanted kind of to understand turnover of housing, house price dispersion, and things like that. So I thought maybe I could do this more generally. And I'm not as mathematically gifted as my two co-authors. So I kind of was solving the model with just a uniform distribution and managed to put something together. And then I kind of buried it. I got working on some other topics. But when I spoke to Pierre, I talked to him a little bit about it. And he said, oh, maybe you should send it to me. And I don't know, many graduate students probably have these files somewhere on their computers, like a 10-page PDF where you worked out some stuff and you're not quite sure what it is. And I sent it to Pierre, and we kind of got excited talking. And then, as Julien said, we were working on it. And that's right. Pierre went to Gerzensee to present a different paper we had with Guillaume. And he called me and said, I met this guy, and he's working on the same topic. And that's how the three of us started working together. Yeah. Pierre, you want to take over?
Yes, so I'm Pierre-Olivier Weill. I'm a professor at UCLA. I've been working on this topic for a while, just like Ben, since my dissertation years. My dissertation years were in Stanford, where I work under supervision of Daryl Duffy. And I guess a lot has been said already, so maybe I'm going to say a little more. So yes, so Ben told me, yes, I have these things. I can work out the equilibrium with a continuous distribution. He sent it to me, and then I was teaching this search theory class at UCLA. I said, oh, okay, I'm going to start teaching it and maybe, maybe derive new results or something like that. So, after a few years of teaching, we had some new results. We started to write a paper. And then in 2014, in Gerzensee, I met Julien, who did this great discussion of our paper, and realized that we had written essentially the same paper. So I guess there was some difference. I think Julien was interested in heterogeneous belief as a mechanism to generate heterogeneity in preferences. And we were more like, a bit housing market style, where agents have different idiosyncratic value for houses. But at the end, the math turns out exactly the same. And after, many fast forwarding, after a couple of papers were written, we realized that the toolkit that we ended up developing could be applied to a broad range of models and insights, and we could just go revisit a good chunk of the literature using that framework. And that excursion in the literature is what became the book.
Yeah, if I could say a little bit more about that. I think one of the so all three of us started teaching courses on the topic because we were obviously spending a lot of our research time doing it. So I teach a PhD class at Penn, obviously Pierre at UCLA and Julien in Lausanne. But also you go to conferences and even in policy circles, over the years that we were working on the topic of over-the-counter markets, which I guess at some point we should actually sit down and talk about what an over-the-counter market is. But over the time period that we were working on, there were a bunch of developments that I think made the literature sort of grow very quickly. So some of those developments, well, one is that a lot of the crises that were taking place, sort of ground zero was different over-the-counter markets, right? So in 2008 and 9, there was a lot of attention paid to the fact that the global financial crisis started in markets like the market for mortgage-backed securities and other types of derivatives. There were issues related to the Fed funds market, repo market. All these markets are over-the-counter markets. As I said, we should talk about more about that. At the same time, data was becoming much, much more available for these markets, right? These are traditionally very opaque markets because the bilateral nature of transactions is really one of the things that the defining characteristics of an over-the-counter market was that there were no prevailing prices. There was no exchange where you could simply look up the price of a particular asset-backed security or corporate bond or municipal bond. These were happening kind of in the dark. And because of various regulations and various technological changes, suddenly there was much better data available to study these markets. So these markets were kind of becoming simultaneously being recognized as very important, increasingly important, and more data becoming available. So more people were working on them, a bunch of issues were coming up. And at the same time, we were working very intensely on developing a variety of tools to analyze these markets and teaching classes on them. And we realized at some point that so much had been done. We had made progress, but many others had also done a lot of work. But there was no kind of single outlet to go where somebody who didn't have a professor to teach them or didn't want to kind of dig through the literature paper by paper. There was no single outlet to learn this literature and learn all the developments that have been taking place. And the last thing I'll say, and then I'll turn it over, is that, along the way also, when you're working on these topics, as everybody, probably every economist knows, you're also always developing these kind of minor results on the side or extensions or things like that don't always turn into a new paper or a new project, but still you realize it's valuable. There's something there. And so I think, all of this pushed us, and I should give credit. I think Pierre was kind of the one who really lit the fire under us to write the book. I was saying, can we put together kind of a unified treatment of this literature that would contain, information both about the motivation, the facts, the issues, but really an emphasis on the tools that were being developed to analyze these types of markets. So.
Very good. That was a perfect also answer to the question, why did you write the book at this stage? So even if we didn't ask it, you answered. That was great. But can you guys say then what, as you said, what the book is about and what do you cover and what do you think people could do with the book? Like, can you tell us a bit about that?
So maybe we have to do a step back and give our promised introduction to
Sure.
what over-the-counter market
Sure.
means. So I'll try. I'll pass on the mic to my co-authors on the topic. So roughly speaking, you can think of financial trades in practice as happening in two kind of market structure. One is a market structure that's has been argued very closely resemble our textbook model of competitive market, which are centralized, limit order book, where in principle trade is completely multilateral, so everyone gather in the same place. So now a virtual trading platform. Prices are firm, so there are prices that are quoted, and you can trade at those. And that would be where the majority of trade for equity take place. But there's a bunch of trade that takes place elsewhere that take place a bit like real estate transaction, as it turns out, where you have to make deals, right, on a case-by-case basis and trade-by-trade basis. So those deals for a long time happen over the phone on a bilateral basis, where investor would call, often intermediaries, or intermediaries would call each other to make those deals. And nowadays, those deals happen you have other pricing mechanism available to you to make those deals. You can run small auctions. So you just query the market, and you get a few, usually not a ton of replies. And the point is that in this market, it's no longer multilateral. Trade happen in small group, and the price are not firm. People have some idea of what price they'll trade at, but it's that ex post, as we would say in search theory, through some kind of bargaining or auction mechanism.
Pierre, can I quickly just? I'm gonna let you
go ahead.
I want to add one thing though, because you're sort of saying it implicitly, but I want to say it explicitly. Is that a feature of these markets is also that you have to find the counterparty.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
If you want to trade a share of IBM, traditionally you say, I go to the New York Stock Exchange. That's where IBM trades. And you don't know who you're trading with, but you're just trading. And so while Pierre was starting to talk about different mechanisms for price determination, I also thought it's just important to emphasize that in most of these OTC markets, you have to find somebody who's willing to trade with you. So anyway, continue, Pierre. Sorry.
Yeah, and so the last thing I wanted to say about OTC market is to give you a sense of how big they are and what securities are traded. So it turns out, a good chunk of publicly traded securities and derivatives as well in publicly traded securities in positive supply and derivatives are traded in over-the-counter markets. So essentially all fixed income is there, corporate bond, municipal bond, treasuries. And then even some part of the equity market is over-the-counter market, especially is organized over-the-counter, especially those trades that are very large. They're called block trades, and many derivatives as well are traded over-the-counter. So Ben was mentioning, ground zero for the financial crisis. So credit default swap, for instance, were traded at the time over-the-counter.
So it's also fair to say that I think maybe everyone knows that, but like you're referring specific to durable goods or assets, right? Because there are a lot of goods that would satisfy this, but it's not the focus of the book, or I'm wrong. Is
No,
that right?
it's a great point. Yeah, I mean these are also great models. I think of durable goods. Models of this ilk have been used to study various types of capital, you know, machines, airplanes. Another item that's not a good but is durable, and people have used these types of models to study is ideas, right? So, you know, for example, like the venture capital markets are typically, you know, there's no exchange. You can't. It's not like you can go someplace and sell your idea. You have to go around and find somebody who's interested in your idea and who can implement it. And so while, yeah, I think a lot of the language throughout the book is kind of just focused on asset markets, but the frameworks themselves can be, you know, applied almost equally as well to a bunch of these other, you know, sort of durable goods and other objects as well.
So one market that I mean, one class of market I should mention that's typically often organized over the counter are credit markets too. So, you know, Ben has important work, for instance, in the Fed fund market, which is a short-term credit market for banks on an overnight basis. There's work on the repo market as well. That's is a form of collateralized credit. And people have used that sort of model to think about bank relationship with firms, etc. So, you know, those tools ends up also widely applicable. We kind of took a bit of a narrow focus on financial markets, but one has to keep in mind that you know, at this level of abstraction, you can do a fair amount of relabeling and start applying tools on each side in other contexts as well.
So the book sounds like now we know what over-the-counter markets are, and it seems like it's even more extended than the asset market context. But on the book, you cover the fundamentally mathematical tools, or you also so yeah, you want to give us what are the main things you teach through the.
So maybe I can do this one. So indeed, what we wanted, I mean, of course, this cannot be, you know, fully self-contained, obviously, but we wanted to have something that is as much self-contained as possible. So we do teach the fundamental mathematical tools, okay, in the sense that you know, after an introductory chapter, which is essentially, you know, a grander version of what Ben and Pierre-Olivier just said about the OTC markets and you know, the extent and size of these markets. We actually start with a chapter on dynamic programming. I mean, geared up to the type of problems that we are going to have to solve in this book, which are typically, you know, sequential search problems where you're present in the market and you're receiving, you're meeting people that make offers to you to buy or to sell a particular asset. Okay, so we developed all that theory. Building as much as possible on things that are well known, and things that are not so well known, we put in an appendix. Okay, so we also have a math appendix that kind of gives you the main mathematical tools we're going to use throughout the book. And then after that essentially intro chapter on the math, we actually cover the different types of OTC markets that we view, and we make a big distinction in the book between two structures. One is a purely decentralized market, so all to all, you know, I can meet anybody, and I have to, you know, I meet that person and I'll trade with that person. Okay, and we also look at another big class of markets, which we call semi-centralized, and these actually are markets where trade is intermediated by dealers, but there is still search. So you need to get in touch with the dealer. All the trades are intermediated by the dealer, but you still are facing the search friction. Okay, so it's a bit different in the sense that I guess the main difference is that in the semi-centralized framework, it's as if you're meeting only one type of guy with whom you can trade. Okay, whereas in a purely decentralized setup, there is uncertainty about the characteristics of the person with whom you're going to trade. Okay, because now it's not just the dealer, it just can be anybody. So we set up the theory of these two, and then we go into a number of variations on these frameworks.
Julian,
and
can I add? Sorry, I keep
yeah.
interrupting. Can I add
Sure.
just a couple of things
Sure.
about it?
You should.
So one reason why there's a few reasons why we study these, what we think of as sort of two benchmarks, right? Okay, so one benchmark being what Julien called the pure decentralized market, where nobody is ex ante assigned to be a dealer. We don't endow anybody with a particular technology that makes them a dealer. And then another one where we do, right? Where there's a pre-assigned set of dealers who have access to a different technology. Okay, so first of all, these are sort of like the two classic models in the literature that the literature has jumped off from. I think a second reason to study these two as benchmarks is that they reflect two different types of markets, right? So the Fed funds market is a pure decentralized market. There are no intermediaries really in the Fed funds market. There's a bunch of banks that go around and trade with each other. Whereas the corporate bond market is a market that's almost entirely intermediated by banks. So there's a very practical reason. And then the last thing that I always thought was interesting is that when you study the pure decentralized market, even though nobody's necessarily endowed with a label of intermediary or dealer, what you end up finding is that certain agents emerge endogenously as people who, or agents who tend to intermediate a lot of trade. So when you kind of step back a minute and say, well, here's where we see the equilibrium outcome where certain agents tend to intermediate all these trades. But why? What were the characteristics that made them intermediaries to begin with? Why does different markets have different market microstructures? That is a model. I think that is a good start to thinking about that. And then I had one more thing, and I turn right back to Julien, I promise. I just want to mention, because this might not be obvious to people if we don't say it. There's this mathematical appendix that I think is really valuable in the sense that it teaches a bunch of tools that are used in this book, but would also be extremely valuable, I find, for other people, especially people who might be working on topics related to search theory, but not necessarily interested in financial markets. So a number of the tools that we use would be really valuable for people who are working in macro labor and using, search models of the labor market, a la Mortensen, Pissarides, and others. Some of the tools in here that are floating around these papers, but have never been quite formalized and written down in this particular way. And then some of the tools actually have not been, but I think they would be super valuable. In particular, there's a parallel between the types of models we work on here and models of job ladders. And maybe we can jump into that later. But a bunch of the tools we use here actually would be very valuable for those people as well. So I just want to flag
let me add something about tools. So, all right. So after some experience, years of experience writing search models, you realize that, in every search model, there is a partial equilibrium model that's a version of the McCall model. And that's what we study in the introductory chapter, and we try to study it in two ways. So we try to give the tools that allow you to get analytical solution when available. We also try to develop the tools that allow you to study this partial equilibrium problem, without explicitly coming up with an analytical solution. So that requires using dynamic programming in ways that are similar to what's done in Stucky Lucas to develop and derive general properties. And depending on the context, you might need one, going full analytical, or the other, derive general properties of, say, monotonicities, etc., continuity, that is often all you need to analyze outcome. And on the context of semi-centralized versus purely decentralized model, So, these are two interesting models that are, theoretically interesting. And as Ben and Julien alluded to, they're important in different applied contexts as well. So when you look at OTC market, there's always a segment which is often a segment is dealer to customer, which look more like the semi-centralized model that we study in the book. But the trades between intermediaries, they look more like the purely decentralized model that we study in the book. And depending on the data you have, so for instance, in corporate bond, a lot of the data concern trade between intermediaries. You might want to use one type of model or the other, or some time model that blend the two, and we have that in one of the chapters as well.
I gotta say, the more I hear, the more I want to find myself in a stranded island with the book in a month just to go over it all by detail. It sounds really exciting. Do you guys want to say anything more about the content, or should we go ask?
No, so I kind of cut Julien off at chapter 5, but there's 12 chapters, so let him continue.
Let's get going. Let's hear more.
Yeah, well, I'll just say all of this briefly. I think one thing that's important to say is that once we have these two kind of benchmark models in place, we essentially decided that we are tying our hands. So because afterwards, once you have treated these two cases, you can think, okay, I want to think about, say, asymmetric information. So I want to bring that into the model. Okay, one way to do it would be to go and literally pick a model off the shelf in the literature and bring it into the book. It's a separate chapter. That would be one way to do it. But we decided that this is too easy. So instead, what we did is we took the point of view that we want everything and every subsequent chapter, and I'll tell you a little bit about what they are about, to be in the same framework. So that everything is covered with the same notation, the same assumptions, everything is the same. You just, it's literally plug and play to some extent. So for this, of course, I think when we decided this, we didn't fully realize what this meant, but I guess now we know that for some of these topics, we ended up on things that are not done at all in the literature. Okay, and examples of that are indeed a fully fledged asymmetric information model, either with private information or with common values, so private or common values. There's not really, that was not fully done in that kind of framework, so we had to develop that from scratch. Similarly, we wanted to bring in, different types of pricing mechanisms, given that in the standard model, pricing is done through Nash bargaining, but we wanted to also first discuss the foundations of Nash bargaining, but we also wanted to have alternative possibilities of pricing, such as, for example, RFQ, the small auctions that Pierre was referring to earlier. And that also was not done in the context of the model. Okay, and so that gives you just a little bit of sense. Similarly, we wanted to look at what happens when you have two competing type of venues, a centralized market, possibly subject to transaction costs, but also a search or OTC market on the side to decide a little bit of, on which side, who trades who and for what purpose. That also we had to essentially do from scratch. So we believe that there's lots of summarizing the literature in that book. There's also lots of stuff that are really, really new.
Yeah, so I mean, those topics were the subject of existing paper, but they had not used exactly this framework. And as we wrote the book, we discovered why. It's because it's actually not so easy to do. So we had to, get ourselves our hand dirty and go and restate and go beyond sometimes some of the arguments that have been proposed before to study, say, price setting, asymmetric information, as Julien said, also the choice of trading decentralized versus centralized, etc.
Yeah, so if I could just add a little bit. So one way to look at the book is that the first couple of chapters are kind of setting this foundation. First with a set of mathematical tools, and then, really familiarizing the reader with kind of the benchmark model. And then, as Julien very nicely said, then we shoot off in different directions, but keeping this kind of within the context of one coherent framework. But the extensions that we do in some ways are almost all, I think, motivated by different applications, right? So Julien mentioned some, right? So, you know, in our model, the benchmark model was done where it was assumed that if a customer meets a dealer, you bargain over the price. You know, Pierre and I have some recent work, but we have data from an electronic trading platform in the corporate bond market, and that's not how it works. How does it work? You send the request for quotes. Some dealers reply, some dealers don't. We say, okay, well, you know, we want a model of that. So we rolled out a model where the pricing mechanism looks a lot like a request for quote system. There's other facts out there that have a lot to do with the fact that a lot of times customers will trade off, you know, smaller or larger bid-ask spreads in exchange for faster or slower trading speeds, right? So if I'm really in a rush, I can get a worse price, but I can trade faster. So that sort of trade-off lends itself very nicely to these models of competitive or directed search that people have been working on, but hadn't really been integrated into this framework of over-the-counter markets very much. There's a few exceptions that I could talk about. Another topic that Pierre alluded to before was trying to understand kind of frictions inside the dealer market. So there's some very cool new papers with data, for example, from the municipal bond market that shows that what happens is you trade a municipal bond to one dealer, then it gets passed dealer to dealer to dealer, and eventually goes to another customer. So how could we think of these chains of trade? Well, as Pierre said, we have a frictional interdealer market where the asset gets passed around a bunch. Then we have a whole chapter because we want to understand crises. What happens, you know, when an aggregate shock hits an OTC market. So we have a whole chapter studying out of steady state equilibria. So we can understand how markets how the frictions interact with shocks and how markets sort of react in times of stress and over the course of a recovery. Again, going back to the private information, we sort of deal with two cases, right? One is more of a rent extraction problem. What if dealers don't know the private valuations of their customers? How do they set prices? How do that private information interact with the other trading frictions that we're talking? And then we have a separate chapter with the common value problem. So what if this is a lemons problem? What if suddenly we don't know the quality of the assets we're being traded?
And I need to give a teaser on price value. You'll find the Schrödinger equation in the book too. So.
Oh, yes. So I'm trying to think, have we missed any? Oh, and then finally, again, you know, this chapter on OTC versus centralized. I mean, this is like one of the oldest and biggest questions in this literature is why, you know, the technology has been around for years to move from an OTC market to a more centralized exchange. But it's not a matter of technology. For some reason, OTC markets have persisted and in some cases grown, even though an exchange was fully possible. So why would that happen? So we have a whole chapter kind of dedicated to that question. So this is just to say that the book is kind of two minds, right? One is kind of, you know, laying out all the technical tools that you would want. And, you know, for a graduate student or for someone just walking in and really wants to understand kind of all the technical aspects, this is a great resource. But at the same time, if you're not interested in learning the Schrödinger equation, but you know, you say, I want to study this particular market, it's an OTC market, here's the issue I want. We wanted you to be able to open chapter 7 and say, this is exactly the model that could help me go to this data or address this kind of policy question. So,
yeah. Well, one thing I should mention related to what Ben just said is that, you know, we also made an effort, which I guess is not completely standard, to actually include exercises in every single chapter. Okay, so that, you know, the graduate student can learn from us, I guess, from the way we do the argument, but they can also work on their own. Okay, because we haven't provided the solutions. Of course, if you guys want to write them up, that would be super.
When I go to this stranded island I mentioned for a month or two,
exactly.
I'll let it happen, send it to you. Yeah, Bruno, you want to take the next one?
Yeah, someone like I'll take the opportunity to, and I hope that's fine, just to talk about the chapters. You talk a lot about this. So you start with introduction, then OTC market facts, sequential search for assets, semi-centralized markets, pure decentralized markets, divisible asset holds is something that you guys didn't mention that you work on, frictional intermediation, price setting mechanisms, OTC markets under stress, and asymmetric information with common and private values, and then centralized versus decentralized market. It's kind of like, is this, how exactly you thought about that? So you talk a little bit that you start with semi-centralized, centralized, and then you add these different kind of values like private information, market under stress. So it's kind of like interesting that it's supposed to kind of give you the ways to do the different tools and how you can mask this kind of things. How exactly you thought about this organization, right? Like the way I see it for me is like trying to teach me how you can change the basic framework. Is that idea? Or I don't know, take it over. What do you want to talk about this?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we probably glossed over a little bit too fast the sort of first main chapter of the book on OTC market facts, because it's more than just a sideshow, I think. And I think we were careful to go through, not just talk about what kind of markets operate OTC, but also to lay out the set of facts and explain why it would be very hard to confront these facts or to address the issues related to these facts in standard models, right? I mean, in some ways, we want to be clear that it's not the case like, oh, this doesn't look like a centralized exchange, so we should come up with a whole new literature. We wanted to be very clear about, if you want to study this phenomenon, if you want to study this policy, starting with a standard sort of frictionless competitive market, is you just have nowhere to go. Okay, so I just wanted to highlight and flesh out a little bit more what's in the first chapter about the facts. But then, Bruno, I think you're right in the sense like, so Julien Pierre did a great job of saying the sort of first kind of technical chapter is literally just about understanding the most basic building block and how to solve these models, and then these two kind of benchmarks that we talked about. But from there, kind of acknowledging the limitations of these two benchmarks if you want to go to data, or if you want to study certain policy questions, or if you want to think about a counterfactual where a new technology arises that allows you to run mini auctions instead of bargaining. So that was the idea, is to kind of introduce the reader to all these different kind of extensions or generalizations of these two benchmark models that either we or many others have done. But I think each one of those generalizations or each one of those extensions was done for a reason, right? So you mentioned the one chapter that I think we forgot to mention, which is that in the baseline model, you either trade kind of 0 or 1 unit of an asset. Okay, but that's a perfect example. So this the sort of, you look at the data and you think, no, I need to understand trading volume. I understand trade sizes. That's not satisfactory to have kind of just two trade sizes in the model. And so that goes back to paper by Lagos and Rocheteau and Nikolai Garlianu had a paper at the same time, where you could understand exactly the motivation for wanting to relax this assumption of indivisible assets to start talking about divisibility.
Can I also ask you talk a little bit about that, but can you be more specific about what are the audience for this book? Of course, everyone in academia that are interested in the work of this is kind of a great place to, even if you're already in the field or you're coming to the field, I guess everyone should read it. But how you think about this? Do you think about a second year PhD course, advanced undergrad, or in general?
So you can use the book in a variety of ways. No? So one, you can use it as your initial reference for if you want to go work on that type of markets and do theoretical work, so you can build your skills from the ground up, based on with solid mathematical foundations. We provide all you need to get started on the topic. It's also a good place to have an overview of the literature, because we have comprehensive notes, or notes that we hope are comprehensive at least, at the end of every chapter. So you can look at the first few chapters, read the facts, understand what we view are good motivation to work on over-the-counter market, and then refer to end of chapter notes to get overviews of existing work and see how what we cover connect to that existing work, where you can go look for extra references to study, maybe over-the-counter markets, say in general equilibrium or in networks, or things along those lines. So the exact intended audience, I'd say, maybe the second year PhDs in economics and finance, maybe advanced undergraduate who have a solid mathematical foundations, could also be interested in this, in reading the book. And all search theories, we hope would find it useful to have the book on their shelf. And we hope there's something for everyone in the field to learn in the book as well.
But and I'll just add, I think Pierre hit the major topics, which is, like most, it's largely a graduate textbook, right? So people interested in the topic, whether they're already, past the PhD, but want to learn this class of model, or during the PhD, so it's a very natural book to use in a second-year PhD course. But also, I would just add that, somebody who works at the Fed, a policymaker could easily be sitting there thinking, Dodd-Frank forces OTC markets onto exchanges. What do we know about that? What do we know about the welfare implications? What do we, so there's a chapter on that. Or, there are some policies in European OTC markets that require a certain number of quotes to be provided to a customer before they can make a trade. So you say, okay, well, what would be the implications of a policy like that? This, again, we tried to make the book such that somebody in that situation with not zero, but hopefully some minimal effort could pick up the book and find a framework, class of models that could allow them to think about the issues of that type.
Yeah, I'd like to also add that, especially in our view, the semi-centralized market model is extremely versatile. It has limitation, of course, because it assumes that some trades are centralized, but for exactly the same reason, it can be extended in endless number of ways to address a really broad number of questions. We offered some of the extension in the book. We really hope that the book offers a stepping stone to go further. We know some data are coming, for instance, about treasury markets. We'll need a version of those models that are geared towards the institutional features of those markets, which we're discovering and learning about more deeply to study them.
So it sounds like it's going to be not only second year folks that want to learn these things, but also policy economists or economists from other fields that want to, take pieces of that theory and put it in other frameworks, which sounds amazing. I have maybe
could I add one more thing to that?
Yeah, sure.
Because I would add, if we're talking about other fields, the one that I would add the most is probably IO. Because this is just an area, I alluded to this earlier, but this is an area where data and model keep leapfrogging. New data comes out, and we face this in some of our papers, actually, the three of us. You look at data and you go, all right, well, we have to change the model a little bit. because you know, the institutional details, how things actually work, is not quite right. So if you want to match the sort of market structure, match the competitive sort of nature of these things, so we modified the model. So I think, in fact, you know, people who think about market microstructure, but also IO more generally, might benefit from some of the things. Sorry, you were going to ask the question though.
Well, no, that was excellent. What I was is so where do you see? I mean, you know, there was as you said, the things kind of started in 2005, but after that, many papers were written and connections with search theory and financial economics in general have been laid out. You know, all of us have one or more papers on various issues. But where do you see the literature, I mean, going in the next few years? Or to put it, all these second-year students that are going to read that book, and what papers do you expect them to write? Maybe towards a more applied direction, maybe put them in more DSG frameworks. Where do you see the next directions will go?
I mean, I can start with one thing, which is, you know, like in the finance literature, I think about the evolution of this literature in some of the same ways that I think about the labor literature just maybe 20 or 30 years earlier, right? That in the 1980s and 90s, started getting much better and better data, not just about sort of aggregate statistics, unemployment rate, this and that, but actually starting to get like worker and firm level data. And so then the models had to be adapted, and eventually you have these like kind of beautiful structural models, carefully calibrated, or in some cases estimated, to match kind of the micro moments, right? So job to job transition, people in and out of the labor force, movement across firms. So I think one direction that the literature is going in now, I hope, is kind of a mirror of that, where, you know, we finally have really kind of transaction level data from these OTC markets, and now we have a class of models that can not just match kind of aggregates like price dispersion or average asset prices or things like that, but understanding, you know, the sort of the intricacies of people moving in and out of markets, passing assets across from each other, going from dealer to dealer. So one area that I do think is that building sort of richer structural models and taking them directly to the data, either through careful calibration or structurally estimating them, I think that's definitely one direction that I would think of as very important. The other thing that I'll sort of, I guess, plug a little bit some of our more recent research as well. One thing that this class of models traditionally kind of scared it around a little bit was the question of how dealers sort of managed their inventory. In fact, if you look carefully, the semi-centralized market is very beautiful and very elegant, very easy to work with, in part because they did not address the dealer inventory problem at all. Dealers in that market, in that model, actually don't hold inventory. But one of the most kind of pressing questions in the policy world right now is, have we introduced regulations after the financial crisis that have made dealers less willing to intermediate, less willing to hold inventory? And so, you know, I think some of the models that are being written right now, taking that decision seriously and how that affects liquidity, welfare, transaction costs, I think are super important. I'll mention two more and then I'll pass it off. So you know, at the same time, we should say this is kind of a very search-based approach to studying OTC markets. And while we've been working on this, you know, there's been a large literature thinking more explicitly about network models and how those models are a good way of capturing fragmented or decentralized markets. Clearly, the two are related. I mean, you know, the process by which you meet and trade with people is essentially the endogenous formation of these networks that people are studying. So I think that there should be papers that think hard about, you know, how the network formation process begins and how certain networks kind of maybe then are disrupted. And related to that, I mean, I think one of the things you find in some of these markets, but not all, is that a lot of transactions are repeated. That relationships are a really important part. And so I see that as sort of a hot topic in understanding better relationships in over-the-counter markets and how that affect, why they form and how that affects allocations, prices, and outcomes.
Can I?
So maybe I'm gonna add similarly to Ben. So often, what makes we have some good understanding of the broad properties of theoretical model and of search model for a long time, right? So what makes the literature progress at this stage is the opening of new applied questions or the arrival of new data. So there, in terms of data, the big flood of data that's coming to us, hopefully is going to continue to come, is about the treasury market. So there is transaction data that's are becoming available now about US Treasury. It's arguably one of the largest and most important financial markets in the world. So I'm assuming that there'll be important work to do on the market. And Ben alluded earlier that OTC market are often ground zero, or have been in the last 20 years ground zero of financial crisis. There's always talk of policy reform, changing the pricing mechanism, forcing dealers to do this or that, changing regulation or regulation elsewhere that end up having unintended consequence to OTC market. To study those things, you're gonna need structural model, always. Structural model allow you to think about the unintended consequences of this or that regulation. So a question that many authors have worked on in the context of various model is, for instance, should over-the-counter market be centralized? So there's this view, at least when you come out of your Econ 101 class, that over-the-counter are just an idiotic way to organize trade. Why don't we all gather in an island and trade with the auctioneer instead? And so, correspondingly, many economists and policymakers say, just let's trade, let's organize trade differently and, close that area of study forever. The truth of the matter is that in practice, there seems to be a demand for trading over the counter. There's no way around it. There've been centralized market, and there are some markets where trade were centralized and then it became decentralized. And so to understand the impact of any of these policy proposals, however intuitively good they seem to you, you have to have a deeper model of the demand for trading in a decentralized way. And many authors have used theories like the one we present in the book, but others as well, to make progress on this question. And most regulatory questions have a theoretical problem attached to them, and that's I don't expect I expect regulatory question about OTC market to continue popping up, and I expect this to continue to give us some interesting work to do.
I have a follow-up question or a refinement of the previous question. You work in, even before the book, you work in several different variations of this model. So for the more technically inclined audience, what do you feel like is something that's really hard that you hope someone can do in the future? What is very technically challenging, something that you try to work with these models, extensions you try to do, or anything that you try to put together, and it's very you had to simplify too much, or you're not satisfied with the what do you have about that? In other words, you talk a lot about the applications of this literature, but besides application, just for pure theoretical reasons, what do you think that there are things that you hope someone can, or you will be doing in the future?
So an example of something like that would be, right now we have a chapter on private values that uses the semi-centralized setup with two sizes of trade. Obviously, bringing that private value problem into the divisible holdings model would be really nice. That's one particular thing that I think would be interesting to do and looks very difficult, because this is multidimensional screening in an equilibrium problem. So that looks very difficult. Another one that I think we brush upon, but more generally, we believe that if you want to really take these models seriously to the data, one thing that there is, or that is clearly missing often, is that there is very little, if any, aggregate uncertainty in the model. Right? It's all idiosyncratic uncertainty about finding counterparties and meeting counterparties. Now, we have a chapter where we deal with one particular realization of one aggregate risk. But of course, more generally, I think it would be a natural thing to do now would be to try to find a way to systematically integrate aggregate risks into these models. And I don't think that's an easy task at all.
I agree. I was gonna say aggregate shocks, and then also, and some of this has been done in the literature, we should be clear, but integrating these models of OTC markets into more general sort of macro models, to understand kind of welfare implications of what happens inside an over-the-counter market more generally on real economic activity and things like that, I think is another challenge of exactly how.
And related to aggregate risk also, so there's also an integration. So, okay, so there's Ben mentioned integration, and so search models tend to be a bit of their own universe of tools and questions, and they don't always. I mean, they've been developed for good reason, right? Because you want to think about market that don't clear in the traditional sense, where supply meets demand instantly. But as a result, there's sometimes a bit difficult to integrate with the models that others work on to address other topics in the same area. So, for instance, the search models often assume risk-neutral investors. There's just one asset. A lot of finance is about forming portfolios and deciding what the blend of assets we should hold, and integrating search theory with portfolio choice theory is something that I think is still a frontier left to work on. And it's not just a curiosity; it's actually important because what portfolio choice insists on is that you're able to substitute, between assets. So maybe you don't like, it's hard to buy Meta, and you can buy Google instead. After all, they're all expose the same kind of risk. The ability to substitute between assets has a lot of implication for the impact of search friction on investors. I mean, you can imagine that if you can search for Meta instead of Google or vice versa, it changed the nature of your search problem. So it's not, and of course there are also implications for portfolio choice because if it's difficult to find assets, then maybe you have to want to form portfolio in different ways. That question in portfolio choice has been addressed, I think, so far with assuming transaction cost mostly, and looking for studying search friction is a much taller order because it brings up the question of how, in what order should I acquire assets? What if I acquired one asset first, and which one should I acquire then, etc., etc.
I think Pierre's point is particularly important given the sort of recent literature on these asset demand systems. This sort of literature where there are these sort of like exogenously estimated heterogeneous characteristics across assets, but in most cases not specified where they come from. So in some ways, thinking about these different frictions in a model with multiple assets would provide micro foundations for the kind of asset demand systems that Koijin and Yogo and others have been thinking about very seriously.
A lot of work for us and the rest. But no, this is exciting. I'm excited to go read go read the book and work out all the things. Bruno, anything else to
Yeah, I would say I would actually would turn to you, the three of you, and just say like, is first of all, like, thank you for writing this. I would definitely be a big consumer. I think there will be a lot of people in the profession that will like, and this is coming from someone that has worked on these models, and every time I work, I find different variations that are kind of hard, that I don't have a good background, and I'm pretty sure people that have not worked on these models would find even more useful. Is there any last kind of message any of you want to deliver to talk to the audience and talk for the future readers of your book?
Buy the book.
Enjoy.
Enjoy. No, I'll let Pierre and Julien answer that. I actually have to run, unfortunately.
And
I have to
don't
get my
report
son.
typos.
Huh?
Don't report the typos, please.
No, send them to Julien, yeah.
And tell us what you want to learn about for next edition.
Excellent, for sure. Thanks very much, folks. That was amazing. And of course, we'll buy and go work everything out, including the typos. We'll let you know. Thank you.
Including the typo.
Guys, thank you for having us on. This was fun.